Queen Elizabeth I has a pretty good reputation in English history. She's associated with things like the victory over the Spanish Armada and Shakespeare, and generally being an effective ruler. And there are many portraits of Queen Elizabeth I, and all of these portraits contribute something to the legend. They all take part in the construction of Elizabeth's identity as an almost supernatural force in English and European politics. But there's always a portrait that stands out as just a little bit weirder than the others. It's often called the rainbow portrait because she holds in her hand something that is at least shaped like a rainbow, if not colored like one. In it, Elizabeth strikingly wears a cloak embroidered with a series of eyes and ears. It's discomforting, funny, outright strange. Whatever it is, it's engaging. And the more time I spend with it and the more I read about it, the more I realize that this portrait is an absolute masterclass in political propaganda. It merges political philosophy with religious ideology and aligns both of them to promote Elizabeth's absolute power. It promotes Elizabeth as a force of nature, uniquely qualified to manage the nation, even though she's a woman within a largely patriarchal and misogynistic culture. And it never really fully undermines the assumptions of that culture. It's playing some really complicated games. So today, let's just take it seriously and see what it has to teach us. And if that sounds like fun to you, please consider subscribing. Okay, before we get into the painting, it's worth getting some basic historical information out of the way. On November 17th, 1558, Elizabeth Tudor became Queen Elizabeth of England. She was a 25-year-old unmarried woman, and she became the monarch of England during a fairly tumultuous historical moment. Earlier in the year of her birth, 1533, her father, Henry VIII, left the Catholic Church and reformed the religious institutions inside England. He transformed the entire political and physical landscape of England when he did that. He redistributed church land, dissolved the monasteries. He made himself the head of the new Church of England. These were not small changes. And it's no coincidence that this break from the church happened in the same year of Elizabeth's birth. Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, and her pregnancy were a major reason that Henry VIII broke from the church in the first place. Anne Boleyn had promised him a baby boy if he divorced his wife and made her queen. Obviously, that didn't work out, but she did give birth to Elizabeth. The point is, and the thing that I'm trying to establish here, is that Elizabeth grew up as England reformed itself around a new faith, a rotating door of queens, and an increasingly impulsive Henry VIII. And if we skip past those younger years to a time when Elizabeth is a 20-year-old young woman, her sister, Mary I, attempted to bring Catholicism back to England. Henry, her father, broke from the church. His first daughter tried to heal those wounds. Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and both Catherine and the young Mary remained loyal to the Catholic Church even as the rest of England transitioned to Protestantism. So when Mary became queen in 1553, she tried to make England Catholic again. To accomplish this, she married the Catholic Prince of Spain, persecuted Protestant theologians, and had Parliament repeal her father's religious laws. She also put the young future Queen Elizabeth in the Tower of London to prevent any rebellions that might attempt to place young Liz on the throne. But it didn't take a rebellion. When Mary died in November of 1558, Elizabeth ascended the throne peacefully. And when she did, she inherited a fairly chaotic political project. A country that, in Elizabeth's 25 short years, had had 4 different monarchs, had redistributed land, and had moved back and forth between religions. It was not a particularly stable situation. I don't think anyone could argue that she was set up for success here. It would have been difficult for anyone to inherit this situation, and Elizabeth was a 25-year-old woman living within a patriarchal society. And so everybody assumed that she would overcome these obstacles by marrying somebody, probably an older man, and that she would then turn over the task of governance to her husband. As you could imagine, the men at court had a lot of opinions as to who this husband should be, but that particular issue was never resolved. Instead, Elizabeth took on the task of governance herself. She never married, or we could say that she chose to marry England itself, and she became the virgin mother to the English people. And it worked. By the time she died on the 24th of March, 1603, she had reigned for almost half a century. She died beloved, and her reign is generally considered one of the most successful in English history. She brought stability to England and left the world with a cult-like following, and we can start to understand the nature of this following by looking at some portraits. The rainbow portrait was produced towards the end of her reign, sometime between 1600 and 1603, and it's an absolute masterclass in political visual propaganda. By investigating this portrait, we can learn a lot about the time period and the narrative Elizabeth used to promote herself, a narrative that not only allowed her to survive as a queen within a misogynistic culture, but to thrive within that role. The earliest date that historians give this portrait is 1600. In 1600, Elizabeth would have been 66 years old. So first, let's acknowledge that this does not look like a 66-year-old lady. Second, it's well known that Elizabeth suffered from a bout of smallpox in 1562, which left her scarred. So it's safe to say that the portrait artist took some liberties with her appearance here. She does not look like a 66-year-old woman with smallpox scars. And you might think, fine, this is like the Elizabethan version of Photoshop or adding an anti-aging filter or whatever. But it's more like divine Facetune. This painting doesn't just smooth out her skin, it rewrites metaphysics. And to fully understand it, we need to know a little bit about the ideology behind the monarchy in England. At the beginning of her reign, the Archbishop of York argued that Elizabeth could not become the head of the church in England because she was a woman. But in that same speech, he argued that she could be the monarch, that by the appointment of God, she is our sovereign, lord and lady, our king and queen, our emperor and empress. And it makes sense that you're confused by that, and not just because of that early modern spelling. The Archbishop is arguing that she can't be the head of the church because she's a woman, but that she can be the sovereign, or monarch, because she's both a lord and a lady. She's both a man and a woman. It's a gender-bending move worthy of Shakespeare. And for this to make any sense at all, we have to understand the medieval concept of the king's two bodies. The idea is that the individual human body occupies the role of king, and those bodies die, but the role of the king goes on forever. So any given king has two bodies, the mortal one that will die, and the political body that is immortal. There are individual kings, but there is also a consistent and eternal sovereign. In the 16th century, with the reign of Mary, followed by the reign of Elizabeth, this old theory took on new life and was applied in new, gendered ways. This is one of the ways that English lawyers could justify having a woman like Elizabeth on the throne. Her body might be female, but politically she was a man. She had two bodies. And Elizabeth leaned into this ideology, most famously at the shores of Essex before the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. In this moment of crisis, Elizabeth famously stood in front of her soldiers and said, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general." She has two bodies here. One is a woman and the other is a king, a general who can lead troops into battle. Under this ideology, the political body existed outside the effects of aging. It's eternal. The natural body of any individual king could get sick, make mistakes, get old, but the political body is flawless, ageless. The rainbow portrait is a portrait of the sovereign Elizabeth, the ageless one, the one without flaws. A curious point here is that this obviously doesn't do much for feminism. Elizabeth's speech and her promotion of this two-body ideology only further entrenches a belief that women are feeble and men are brave. But that's part of the propaganda embedded in this image and those like it. It's using patriarchal narratives to underwrite and buttress the reign of Queen Elizabeth. The concept of the two bodies allows Elizabeth to be queen while preserving the conservative structures of patriarchy. And that two bodies concept isn't the only way that this portrait leveraged her artificial youthful face to preserve oppressive views on femininity. Another implicit argument being made by the rainbow portrait is that Elizabeth's virginity removed her from the aging process. Because Elizabeth never married, officially she remained chaste her entire life. She was the Virgin Queen. And at a time when sexual purity standards were an essential element of feminine virtue, Elizabeth's virginity came to represent and explain her success as a monarch. Her virtue, as understood through her virginity, kept her young and fertile. So, as the scholar Susan Frye has pointed out, the inherent claim was that her active virtue, so often particularized as her virginity or chastity, protected Elizabeth from the aging process, helping preserve her metaphoric fertility in the guise of a continuing physical fertility. Her represented denial of old age was an assertion of her political viability, an attempt to transcend her society's tendency to disparage and ignore any woman past childbearing age. And again, this argument does not refute sexist attitudes towards women past childbearing age. It's simply arguing that those attitudes don't apply in this particular case of Queen Elizabeth, whose virtue, understood through her virginity and the concept of the king's two bodies, distances her from being lumped in with the other women. You know, she's not like other girls. And these arguments about agelessness, virtue, and virginity were similar to arguments made about the Virgin Mary in medieval theology. The Virgin Mary is as flawless as a human being could be, and under many traditions, she is just assumed into heaven rather than needing to experience death. Elizabeth was very clever about using the language and traditions associated with the Virgin Mary to promote herself. They were, after all, both virgin mothers. So, to close out this section, this painting uses the Mask of Youth to tap into medieval political philosophies about the king's two bodies, while also referring to religious ideologies about chastity and virtue to promote Elizabeth's position as a physically strong and virtuous spiritual leader. Good. It's worth noting that as it promotes her as a physically strong and virtuous leader, it's also promoting an absolutist ideology, an argument that the monarchy exists outside of natural forces, that she is uniquely qualified to run the nation. It's an argument to centralize power under a single individual who is protected by God. So that youthful face is doing a lot of work here. But so is her clothing. So let's turn our attention to that creepy cloak that she's wearing. So these eyes and ears adorning the cloak are probably the most striking feature of this portrait. And just like the ageless face participated in both political and religious propaganda to promote absolutism, so do these eyes and ears. The political reading, I think, is fairly straightforward. These eyes and ears represent the monarch's ability and responsibility to see and hear everything in her kingdom. Elizabeth is the living embodiment of England, and as such, she embodies the laws and virtues of England, and these laws and virtues keep England stable, and the enforcement of these laws and virtues requires surveillance. By seeing and hearing everything, Elizabeth can punish all the crimes and help anyone in need. As Daniel Fishland has noted, the Queen watches and listens vigilantly, seeing from all perspectives, hearing in all directions. The eyes and ears both warn and comfort us that Elizabeth sees and hears everything. The cloak is Big Brother. But there's also a religious element here. In the book of Matthew, Jesus explains his use of parables and tells his apostles that they will be able to see and hear the wisdom embedded in the stories. He says, "But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear," before delivering the parable of the sower. The implication is that the true believers, those who were blessed by Christ, will be able to see and hear the wisdom embedded inside the parables. So by wearing a cloak of eyes and ears, Elizabeth is literally cloaked in the true faith. The historian Rene Graziani explains this by saying that in the portrait, we are to understand that the Queen wears this blessing like a cloak or mantle. She is one who has seen and heard, an exemplary Christian and somebody specially favored. She individually receives the wisdom of Christ and clothes herself in it. She mediates the relationship between her country and the Word of God. Additionally, you may have noticed the snake on Elizabeth's sleeve. And this iconography is most often linked with the virtue of Prudence, who is often featured with a serpent. The threat or evil implied by the serpent requires prudence and constant vigilance. The vigilance reinforced by the presence of those eyes and ears. So the cloak represents both her political and spiritual ability to deal with that ever-present threat of evil. And if, as I've been zooming in and out of the details of this cloak, you've been thinking, wait a second, that's not just eyes and ears. Those are mouths on the cloak as well. And yeah, there has been plenty of academic ink spilled over this issue. Some say those are just folds. Some say those are mouths. There are even some who have argued that those folds might be subtle representations of Elizabeth's sexuality, and the placement of her left hand might reference her sexual autonomy, her ability to satisfy herself without a man. But we don't need to get into that here. What's important to this particular video essay is that this painting uses both political and religious ideology through the eyes and ears embroidered on that cloak, and that the message embedded in those ideologies places Elizabeth in a privileged position of absolute power. And we haven't even discussed the rainbow yet. On the extreme left of this painting, above the rainbow, we can read the Latin phrase, non sine sole iris. When translated directly into English, it says, no rainbow without the sun. When translated into Elizabethan propaganda, it might mean, you better appreciate me while I'm still shining. When discussing the iconography of a rainbow, it's probably best to start with the religious meaning. The image of the rainbow is biblical. In the book of Genesis, God flooded the earth and only spares Noah's Ark. Once the rain stops, God puts a rainbow in the clouds as a token of the covenant between him and earth. It represents the promise that God won't flood the earth again. He says, and the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. It is a symbol made by God so that he remembers his promise to humanity. That's the dominant meaning of any rainbow in the Christian world. So it's notable here that Elizabeth holds the rainbow. The rainbow is produced by God to serve as a reminder to God. So Elizabeth's command of the rainbow places her, in some ways, in the position of God. There are obviously political implications with that. On one level, we can understand that this represents another example of how Elizabeth mediates the relationship between God and her country. But on another level, we can understand that this represents Elizabeth's covenant with England, her promise to protect them. In both cases, this imagery places Elizabeth outside the normal rules of humanity. In both cases, it says that England needs her and argues for centralizing power in her. We might also recognize that this portrait does not have a clear external light source. There are not a lot of shadows here, and none on Elizabeth's skin. Either Elizabeth is being lit from multiple angles, or Elizabeth is herself the light source. As the scholar Roy Strong has said, the queen is lit neither from the left nor from the right, but actually seems to radiate light as she moves before the arc that encompasses her figure. She is the sun, without which there can be no rainbow. There can be no relationship with the divine except through her. Now, again, as I'm zooming in on this painting, you might say to yourself, that rainbow doesn't seem to have rainbow colors. And yeah, there has also been some academic ink spilled on this topic, and I am not going to claim to have any answers. I can tell you that some scholars have argued that this painting dates to the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, and that rainbow isn't bright because the sun that produced it, Elizabeth, is either dead at the time of its production or close to it. So the faded rainbow mourned the loss of Elizabeth. Or it's possible, as some others have argued, that the strange coloring of the rainbow here is symbolic of the rainbow as an extension of Elizabeth. It has the same colors as her cloak. So maybe the rainbow isn't bright because Elizabeth outshines it, and the force of her presence forces her color onto the rainbow rather than the other way around. The rainbow becomes an extension of her as she shines brighter. Either way, the rainbow has both political and religious significance that promotes the absolute authority of the monarch to oversee the nation. Everything about this painting promotes a very particular vision for centralized control and absolutist politics. It is a masterclass in propaganda that weaves together political and religious ideologies all towards a single goal: the promotion of Elizabeth as a uniquely qualified center of power. And that's all I've got to say about this one, but this has been a really fun one for me to research. 20 years ago, I did a research degree on Elizabethan theater and visual culture, and writing this video felt like a return home for me. So I'm probably going to write some more on Elizabethan portraiture. Subscribe to be notified when that happens, and thank you for watching.